Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well, and welcome to the Chali Institute Human Progress and Flourishing workshop. My name is Ahmad Al-Asadi, and I'm an assistant professor of management, and I'm a Chali Institute faculty scholar. And today it brings me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Daniel Bennett from the University of Louisville. So Dr. Daniel Bennett is an associate professor of entrepreneurship. He's the director of the Entrepreneurship PhD program and associate director of the Center for Free Enterprise at the University of Louisville. He's also an editor of Small Business Economics, and his research seeks to better understand how environmental changes influences entrepreneurship and innovation, and the implications for regional and national economic development. And his work has been published in journals such as the Journal of International Business Studies, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and the Journal of Business Venturing, among others. We're very fortunate to have Professor Bennett with us today, and please join me in welcoming him. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so good morning. Thanks everybody for coming out on a beautiful Friday afternoon in Fargo, North Dakota. This is my first time in the city, and I'm telling my host that it's been quite lovely. It's a nice city, very clean, and I've enjoyed being here. And the weather here is nicer than it is back home in Louisville. So they're right now, like, the schools have canceled, the university has been closed because of weather. So it's very nice to be here. See if I get home. So we've got some sound effects from outside for dramatic appeal. I arranged for that ahead of time. So I'm going to make sort of really important points. We'll see if we get sort of the reverberation. So, all right. So the title of my talk today is The Political Economy of Entrepreneurship Policy. So I switched the title a little bit. So if you saw some marketing earlier that was going to talk about democracy, I decided to shift gears a little bit. We'll still talk about politics a little bit, but we'll try to stage away from that sort of controversial topic, given where we're at in the political cycle here. So let's jump right in here. Okay, here we go. All right, so let me give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about before I tell you. So first of all, we're going to do a little bit of sort of front matter conceptualization, make sure we're all on the same page on what is entrepreneurship and why it might be important for an important public policy matter. Then I'm going to introduce you an important, an insightful framework developed by William Baumol on how we might think about analyzing entrepreneurship policy. And then we'll talk about two different sort of broad approaches to entrepreneurship policy, which I'll briefly sort of talk about in terms of being more of a top-down intervention approach versus a bottom-up sort of laissez faire approach. And then we'll sort of sum things up. Does everybody have normally some of your classes you go to, the professor might tell you, put your smartphones away. But I'm actually going to ask you to pull out your smartphones because I'm going to have some QR codes for you to just go to answer throughout the presentation. So if you have your phone, if you don't have does anybody not have a smartphone? Congratulations. I'm thinking about going off the grid myself after reading Jonathan Haidt's book. So, but we'll use that tool a couple of times throughout the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So before I sort of tell you what entrepreneurship is, I want to sort of get your thoughts on what's the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you hear the word entrepreneurship. So if you scan the QR code there, you can enter your responses, and I'll give you a minute. Opportunity, right? Building a company, innovation, markets, be your own boss, courage, passion, creator, money, courage, self-motivated, freedoms, liking this, creator, gutsy, creative passion, very cool. calculated risk, leader, risk-taking. Okay, great. So a lot of different sort of ideas on what is entrepreneurship out there amongst people sitting here, and that's great because entrepreneurship scholars ourselves don't have an agreed upon definition. I'll give you my definition in just a second. But interestingly here, I did not see anybody put government. That's not a word that appears on the screen. But that's what I'm going to talk to you about today is government and public policy and its sort of implications for entrepreneurship. All right, so what do I think of as entrepreneurship? Now, this is not the only definition. You can ask Ahmad here, and he'll tell you that we just don't agree on what the definition is, but here's mine. A process of identifying business opportunities that solve problems and create value under conditions of uncertainty. All right, so let me unpack this just a little bit and tell you, what I mean by these terms. And some of you had responded about opportunities, so that's good, but what do I mean by that is, recognizing an unmet need in the marketplace or some sort of inefficiency, okay? Problem solving is another key term here. So developing some sort of innovative solution to address the problem that's identified. Creating value, introducing a product or services that benefit others and produce a profit, okay? So that's important here. And also uncertainty. So this is just the unpredictable nature of business where your outcomes are really unknown, okay? All right, so now that we have an understanding of what I'm trying to conceptualize as entrepreneurship, why might that be important for politics and for policy? Well, one reason is that entrepreneurs create businesses. Those businesses employ people, right? So job creation is always a political win if a politician can sort of create policies that spur job creation. Innovation, right? So innovation promotes productivity, efficiency, helps us create solutions to problems that we have. Competition, right? We saw that on one of the responses that competition is good in the sense that it helps improve the product quality, as well as it can drive down prices and make things more affordable for us. It makes us better off. From a policy perspective, if you're anybody have any experience working for government here? Any politicians? Yeah. So you have a budget, right? And that budget comes from somewhere, and it's typically tax revenues, right? So businesses pay taxes, and so that can be very important from a policy perspective. Is if you can encourage businesses to form and be successful, then you can generate revenues from them, and also a social impact, right? So a lot of people increasingly care about social and environmental issues, and entrepreneurs help solve those problems. Okay. So as you can see, there's a multiple of reasons why policymakers might think that encouraging entrepreneurship is a good thing, okay? All right, so here's the two approaches that I'm going to talk about and try to compare and contrast them, talk about some of the theoretical reasons why we might take the different approaches, as well as talk about some of the evidence about them. All right, so the first is the laissez faire, or the bottoms-up approach. And so what I'm going to talk about for each of these is sort of the role of government under these approaches, the assumption that is being made about markets, and also how resources are allocated under each approach. So with laissez faire, the government really plays an indirect role, and that's to sort of establish an institutional policy environment that protects property, enforces contracts in a predictable manner, minimizes sort of distortions in the marketplace so that entrepreneurs are free to utilize their time, talent, and resources to pursue opportunities. Okay. Meanwhile, the intervention approach is more of a top-down government approach. The government plays a more direct role in sort of intervening in the market in order to support entrepreneurs. So you might think about things like grant programs, different subsidies, even sort of different types of regulations that might, or tax policies that might impact different sectors or specific entrepreneurs. Now, these two approaches have a very different assumption about the role of markets. Okay, and the laissez-faire approach, very popular among a lot of economists. The sort of approach is that, yes, there are inefficiencies, there are shortcomings to markets, there's imperfections, but entrepreneurs are the ones who sort of will step up and solve those inefficiencies through sort of private sector solutions. Meanwhile, the other approach, the intervention approach, typically will assume that there are market failures that exist, and that those failures need to be solved by the government. Okay, so there's very different assumptions taking place, and I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about like what I mean by market failure and why that's important in the realm of entrepreneurship. And lastly, I'll talk about the resource allocation. So with the laissez faire approach, typically we're talking about entrepreneurs identifying opportunities and directing resources or channeling resources to their highest valued use. So that's how resources get allocated in this approach. But in the top-down approach, typically where the government is strategically directing resources to key underinvested sectors. All right, so this is just a very broad overview. We'll delve a little bit deeper into sort of each approach as we go on. All right, so before we do that, I want to introduce what I think is a very valuable framework for us to think through how to compare these two approaches, as well as sort of set an objective on what I think is reasonable to promote good policy. All right, so this is a very famous framework developed by Will Baumol in his 1990 Journal of Political Economy paper, in which the paper is called Entrepreneurship, Productive, Unproductive, and Destructive. Okay, and so this is a quote from his paper where he says, "The productive contribution of society's entrepreneurial activities varies because of the allocation between productive activities such as innovation and largely unproductive activities such as rent-seeking or organized crime." All right, so what does he mean by these terms? Okay, his definition of productive entrepreneurship very closely matches or aligns with the definition of entrepreneurship that I provide with you, which is sort of create values through for others in society. So things like innovation would count as productive. Unproductive activities, that term might be a little less familiar to you. He threw out the term rent-seeking there. If you haven't taken sort of a public choice economics class, you might be unfamiliar with this term. But the idea here is rather than creating value that sort of enlarges the size of the economic pie, what this type of entrepreneurship does is really sort of reallocate resources from one person to another. So we're not really expanding the size of the pie, we're just like redistributing it, right? So as an example of that, we might think about sort of a local company that might go to the governor's office and ask for a special tax break for their company, right? And so they're not really like creating new value by creating products or services. They're rather sort of using the coercive arm of government to redirect resources to themselves. Okay, and then Baumol also talked about, he distinguished between these two types of entrepreneurship and what their implications are for economic development, but he also had a key insight in the paper talking about what influences this allocation, and it talked about the institutional and policy environment as sort of creating the incentives that might lead entrepreneurs to allocate their time and effort towards the different types of activities. Okay, so the institutions, the policy framework, very important for this framework. And what I'd like to propose as a reasonable policy objective is let's create policy that maximizes productive entrepreneurship and minimizes unproductive entrepreneurship. Does anybody think that's a reasonable, or does anybody not think that's a reasonable objective? Raise your hand. Please tell me if I'm wrong. No? Okay. All right, so everybody's on board with this. Okay, cool. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into each approach. And first, let's talk about this sort of top-down intervention approach. Has anybody read this book by Mariana Mazzucato, The Entrepreneurial State? No, I don't recommend it. But she's making quite a big impression with her work, sort of advancing this sort of more interventionist approach, saying that the state or government needs to behave more entrepreneurial, they need to be allocating resources, etc. So it's definitely a big proponent of this. One of my friends, academic friends, is from Brazil, and he said, yeah, like Mazzucato was getting invited by the president of the country to come down there and advise our country on how we can become more entrepreneurial. So she's definitely having a big practical impact with her book. Okay, and she's sort of taking this top-down approach. Okay. All right. So what are some of the let's sort of step back and talk about some of the theoretical assumptions that sort of justify this approach. As I mentioned up front, there's this idea that market failures exist. Does anybody know what a market failure is? You want to share?
It's usually identified by market power, information asymmetry, and externalities.
Okay, all right.
Three types.
Yeah, so there's some sort of imperfection, right, in the market that exists that leads to a sort of under allocation of resources towards their most valued use, more or less. It could be because of power, it could be because of, as you mentioned, information asymmetries. But there's something that exists that's sort of holding back the economy from sort of achieving what it can. All right, so in the realm of entrepreneurship, we might think about private markets failing to invest an optimal amount of resources in entrepreneurial ventures, particularly in sort of innovation, early stage innovation, right? And so the idea here is that there could be different factors that lead people not to want to sort of invest their resources in highly uncertain technologies in which we don't even know if it's going to work. We don't know if there's a market that exists for these technologies. So it's just too risky for anybody to sort of invest in. So we might need sort of the government to come in and sort of encourage that. All right. So the second sort of assumption we're talking about is the government's going to come in and play this corrective device. So implicit in that is that policymakers can identify the failures that exist and design policies to correct them. Okay. And then they're going to make strategic investments to allocate resources to entrepreneurs and sectors that sort of have potentially high social returns. So this is sort of like the argument for basic research and sort of new technologies that are often funded by government grants, etc. Okay. All right. So what are the objectives in terms of like promoting entrepreneurship? As I mentioned, there's sort of believed to be a lack of appetite for risk in sort of certain new technologies, and so this sort of government funding in this sectors can help sort of bridge financing gaps, provide our entrepreneurs, our inventors with a little bit of resources to start up and start pursuing these type of technologies. Hopefully also to stimulate innovation, to promote the development of new products and technologies that might otherwise be too risky for private investors to invest in, and from a sort of a policy perspective, could be to enhance the competitiveness of the economy by fostering development of strategic sectors with potential to generate long-term economic growth and national competitiveness. All right, so these are some of the objectives of a more top-down policy. All right, so next I want to, that's sort of like the theoretical angle, and hopefully it wasn't too deep, but I want to talk about some of the evidence for top-down policies that we've sort of uncovered in our research, and I'll frame this as the good, the bad, and the ugly, okay? So oftentimes this sort of looks like government like acting as a venture capitalist, and a venture capitalist is typically an investor that's investing in an early stage startup that has a lot of uncertainty but also a lot of potential for creating a lot of value, and so the government's sort of playing that role in this sort of policy approach. Okay. So one way that they might do this is playing what's called a certification role. And what I mean by that is if a startup is able to get some funding from the government, it might sort of signal to the market that they're producing something that's legitimate, and so other investors might want to sort of step in and sort of fund these ventures because they've been sort of certified as having successfully navigated a grant application or something like that. And so there's actually some evidence that sort of these sort of national policies have been effective in playing the certification role. For instance, there was a program in Australia called the Innovation Investment Fund that they discontinued the policy in 2014, but it was studied by Doug Cummings, who's at Florida Atlantic University now, and really one of the top, I would say one of the top entrepreneurial finance scholars in the world, and you'll see his name a couple of times here. But he sort of did a deep dive study on that program, and he did find like evidence that their program was working pretty well in terms of companies that had been funded through this fund were able to sort of get follow-on funding from private investors. Okay. Similarly, some European scholars found some evidence in Europe about the effectiveness of these sort of government venture capital funds. And there's the sound effect, right? You didn't expect that. So there's some other evidence that these things worked. All right. There's also some evidence that these firms benefiting from these policies have been able to patent their innovations. As we might think about, patents are an important form of intellectual property right that allows the inventor to, capture the value from the innovation they've created for a certain period of time, right? So there is significant evidence that firms that receive funds from different government programs are more likely to sort of patent their innovations. Sabrina Hall published this paper in the American Economic Review, which is the top economics journal, arguably the top economics journal in the world, doing a sort of very close dive on a program in the U.S., and that's what she found in her research. So here's some evidence that these sort of policies could enhance productive entrepreneurship, which is part of our framework. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what I would call the bad. All right. So there's some evidence that these sort of government policies crowd out private investment. So ideally, we want investors to take the risk in investing in sort of uncertain technologies. And there is the possibility that if the government plays too active of a role in investing in sort of new technology, that it might reduce an entrepreneur's incentive to seek out money from private investors. And again, Doug Cummings and one of his co-authors, Jeff McIntosh, examined a program in Canada, and they found significant evidence that the program, that the GVC, the Government Venture Capital Fund, was crowding out private investment, sort of squashing the opportunities for venture capitalists to sort of invest in these sort of technologies. Here we see Doug Cumming again in another paper with John Amore looking at cross-country evidence, and found very similar evidence that these sort of government venture capital funds were sort of crowding out private investment. There are arguably some studies finding that it might crowd in, but I think the evidence is pretty mixed. All right. Another potential bad outcome is that here we see Doug Cummings again in a paper in the Journal of Corporate Finance. This is one of the top sort of finance journals, finding that firms that were funded by government venture capitals funds were less likely to experience an exit. And when I talk about a successful exit, and when I say a successful exit, what I mean by that is not that they failed, but they've actually matured into a firm that has either been acquired or gone through an initial public offering, which provides a huge infusion of cash. and opens up the company to sort of being a regulated, publicly traded company on the stock markets, right? And if you're a venture capitalist, this is the outcome you're looking for, right? You're making these huge investments in these early stage startups because you want to experience a exit because you're going to be a large stakeholder, and once that company goes public, you're going to be able to cash in on that investment, because otherwise your shares in that company before it goes public are not very liquid, right? You really can't make any money until the company does exit. So what they found in this paper was that firms that are receiving government venture capital are less likely to experience exits than relative to similar companies that did not receive these funds, okay? And lastly, and I think this is a big issue, is that these firms could encourage what a team of Swedish researchers called subsidy entrepreneurship. And the idea here is that unproductive firms are going to be more likely to seek subsidies than compete in the market. So it's easier just to sort of ask the government for money to subsidize your company than to try to invest in sort of creating value for your consumers, right? And so in this paper by Alperovich and colleagues, they found significant evidence of this in the context of Belgium. And as I mentioned before, there's a team of Swedish economists who looked at all the portfolio of different subsidy programs in Sweden and found that the firms that were more likely to seek out grants from these different schemas were far less efficient than the firms that did not, and they were also more likely to receive funding. So here we see some evidence that these sort of policies can create unproductive entrepreneurship as well as lead to some other bad outcomes. All right, so let's sort of hone in on a program that some of you might be familiar with, and it's a policy called the Small Business Innovation Research Program. It's a federally administered program that provides, it's actually a long-running program introduced in 1983. It provides grants to small technologically oriented firms to encourage sort of technological innovation and sort of the stated objective from the beginning of the program was always to sort of encourage commercialization, to bridge these financing gaps that we talked about at the beginning, all right? So since its inception, they funded more than 32,000 different firms. In the 2022, the most recent year that data is available on their website, more than 3,700 firms received grants from this program, and the total expenditures on those grants were $4.3 billion, all right? Now, we read sort of government expenditure data all the time, and so this may seem like a drop in the bucket in terms of total government spending, but it's pretty significant. If you sort of take that number and divide it by the number of people living in the U.S., it works out to about $13 per person, right? So you contributed, on average, each of you, $13 to these firms, okay? Economists have a term for this. Why do these programs persist? And it's because you have these sort of narrowly concentrated benefits to the firms that are sort of investing in these, getting grants from this program, but then the costs are widely dispersed. $13 is not that much to each of you, so no one's really going to have much to say about that, okay? We're not collectively going to put our efforts together to stop this program, even if we think it's terrible, because it's only costing us $13. It's not worth anybody's individual time. All right, so let's look at some of the evidence on this program, okay? So I've already previously mentioned the Sabrina Howell's paper, where she looked at SBR recipient firms. She found that they're more likely to patent their innovations. And she also found some evidence these firms were more likely to receive sort of private investments. So some evidence that it's stimulating some productive entrepreneurship. In a separate paper, Lauren Lanahan at the University of Oregon found that SBR recipient firms they hire fewer employees, right? So to the extent that this policies intended to create jobs, no evidence that it's creating jobs. In fact, firms may be hiring employees after they get a grant, and then they sort of fire the employee when the grant money runs out, right? So it's not really sort of creating sustainable jobs. Lauren Lanahan, in a separate paper, looked at the certification role. Remember, we talked about that these sort of programs might encourage firms to, like legitimize them so that other investors might follow on with funding. She found that in this paper, there is a certification role, but this certification role diminishes as a firm receives multiple awards, right? So if a firm keeps going back to the government, like to get more grants, they're less likely to get any follow-on investing, okay? And so begs the question, does the program potentially encourage subsidy or unproductive entrepreneurship? So I took a look at the data. And there are more than 550 firms that to date have received more than 50 plus awards from this program, more than 200 that have received more than 100 awards, right? So yeah, there's some evidence that this program is encouraging productive entrepreneurship, but also some evidence potentially that it's encouraging unproductive entrepreneurship if firms are just sort of surviving with grants for this program. All right, now let's talk about the ugly, and let's see if this video will work. All right, does anybody remember the case of Solyndra? All right, a few of you. All right, so this short video will talk about it.
Congress is trying to figure out who's to blame for the collapse of Solyndra, the solar panel company that filed for bankruptcy last week after running through more than $500 million of taxpayer stimulus money. John Blackstone tells us House Republicans are pointing fingers at the White House.
For the Obama administration, this was supposed to be a shining example of what $500 million in stimulus could achieve. Instead, Solyndra's solar panel factory operated for less than a year before the company declared bankruptcy 2 weeks ago. At a congressional hearing today, House Republicans presented excerpts from emails suggesting the Obama administration rushed the Solyndra loan. Representative Steve Scalise read from an Office of Management and Budget message urging caution.
Quote, this deal is not ready for prime time. Go to the next slide. And given the time pressure we are under to sign off on Solyndra, we don't have time to change the model.
Jeffrey Zients of the OMB said the administration was simply asking about the timing for a groundbreaking ceremony.
There was a request from the Vice President's office about scheduling logistics for a potential event.
The loan was approved, and in May 2010, the President visited Solindra's factory, still under construction.
Solyndra expects to hire 1,000 workers to manufacture solar panels and sell them across America and around the world.
Solyndra boasted about its advanced technology, but now there are suspicions its political connections were at least as important in securing its huge government loan. The biggest investor in Solyndra is Oklahoma billionaire George Kaiser, a major fundraiser for the Obama presidential campaign.
Obama being there, everybody figured, okay, this company can't fail.
Peter Kolstad was among 1,000 workers laid off when it did fail.
All the news that's coming out, you wonder where a lot of the money went.
Where the money went is undoubtedly what FBI and Department of Energy investigators were looking for when they raided Solyndra last week. And it is what Solyndra executives are certain to be asked when they're called before the same congressional committee next week. John Blackstone, CBS News, Fremont, California.
All right, so for those of you in the room that remembered Solyndra, this is a reminder for those of you who may have been too young to sort of experience that. It is definitely a case of sort of misallocation of funds and potential crony capitalism, in which the video talked about that politically connected sort of investors were sort of influencing the allocation of sort of government funds towards companies that they had a private interest in. All right, so we've got this sort of example of potential government failure and crony capitalism, and of course probably the government has learned their lesson. We're not going to do that again, right? Nobody's agreeing with me? Okay. All right. So did the government learn their lesson? I don't think so, because is anybody familiar with the CHIPS Act that passed recently? The CHIPS Act, okay. So part of that fund went to $6.6 billion went to a company run by the former CEO of Solyndra, right? So obviously political connections are still pretty important in sort of influencing the allocation of resources. So that's the ugly. That's the ugly of the approach. All right. So we've talked a little bit about some of the potential benefits, some of the challenges, but to sum it up, this approach, we have knowledge problems, right? Policymakers are not omniscient, right? One of the assumptions of the approach is that they can sort of identify market solutions. That requires them to have particular knowledge, but as we mentioned, entrepreneurship is an inherently uncertain endeavor, so we have to question whether they have the ability to sort of predict the winners. Here's a famous quote from Friedrich Hayek. I won't read that to you for sake of time. We also have an incentive problems, right? Policymakers often don't have any skin in the game, whereas private investors do, right? So that resources may be allocated based on political connections, as opposed to sort of actually trying to achieve solve market failures. And we also have seen examples of unintended consequences that we may see incentivized unproductive entrepreneurship. We may see some crowding out of private investment. So we have to sort of weigh the good versus the bad and the ugly, okay? All right, so here's a break for you guys to answer another question. Why do you think policymakers intervene in markets to support entrepreneurship? So I'll give you 5 choices here. You can select the one you think is most important. Okay. Well, I think we have enough answers here to see what the sort of the voters think, and the voters think that one of the major reasons is to gain political support from an important voting constituency. Somebody thought to generate tax revenue and to facilitate innovation. Okay. So for sake of time, I'm gonna move ahead here. All right, and so I'm going to try to give you a sort of similar overview of the second approach, which is more of a bottoms-up, laissez, faire approach. And we might think about, if we've heard about the term economic freedom, that's sort of what we're talking about here. And the idea here is that assuming that markets and entrepreneurs can sort of eventually efficiently allocate resources to their highest valued uses, the entrepreneurs and individual decision makers are the ones who should identify the opportunities and develop the solutions. And the government plays a more indirect role here by sort of providing an institutional framework that protects individuals and their property, provides a predictable sort of contract enforcement regime, allows voluntary exchange to take place, minimizes sort of the arbitrary barriers to entry and competition, and also allows profit and loss to determine firm and outcomes, as opposed to sort of governments deciding like which firms are too big to fail and which deserve to fail. All right, so like overall, just going to refer to this as economic freedom here. And here's the skyline of one of my favorite cities in the world, Hong Kong, which until recently was the most economically free country in the world for like 20 years. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to sort of get to the evidence because I think that I'm running a little behind here. So the idea is that economic freedom, or this sort of bottoms-up approach, reduces uncertainty in exchange, meaning it doesn't reduce the fundamental market uncertainty, but it does allow me to have confidence that if I'm engaging in transaction with somebody, that there'll be recourse if that person sort of decides to back out of our contract or tries to violate my property rights. So I'll have lower transaction cost and also minimal distortions of this market process, so that I can focus on really sort of dedicating my talents and resources towards solving the problems I think are important, and also to provide a level playing field rather than favoring politically connected firms such as Solyndra. All right. So there's considerable evidence on the effectiveness of this approach in promoting entrepreneurship. Generally, I'll talk about a few of the studies. This paper by Boris Nikolaev and Chris Boudreau, they looked at like 44 different potential predictors of country-level measures of opportunity-motivated entrepreneurship. And what emerged from their really rigorous analysis that was that economic freedom was the most important and robust predictor out of 44 different ones. Okay. My colleague at the University of Louisville, Steve Goldman, had this paper where we found that individuals are much more likely to prefer to be entrepreneurs in economically free countries. This paper, published in the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance, found that corporations are much more likely to invest in innovation in economically free countries. And one of my own papers looked at economic freedom at the local level in the United States, and I found that cities that have more economic freedom at the local level exhibit higher rates of entrepreneurial entry. I also thought that they would exhibit higher rates of business failure, but actually I found no effect there. So here's another paper that I wrote with Boris Nikolaev, and what we looked at in this country was, in this study, was innovation outputs at the country level, and just graphically we sort of plotted two different measures of innovation by the level of economic freedom, and sort of looked at the average scores by quartile, and you can see the blue line here. These are the top 25% of most economically free countries in our data set, and by and far they perform better in terms of encouraging innovation than less economically free countries. Okay, I've got some other evidence here, but for sake of time I'll sort of skip through this, but these are just sort of diving deeper into some of the mechanisms, because a lot of entrepreneurship research focuses on individual level characteristics as being a predictor of whether someone engages in entrepreneurship. And what some of these more recent studies have found is actually the economic freedom plays an important role in sort of whether people that have these characteristics are more likely to become entrepreneurs or not. Okay, so for sake of time, I'll sort of skip through these. All right, so just to wrap up, got these two approaches. They have a very different sort of perspective on the government's role, with the laissez faire approach being more like indirect, protecting the institutions, and the intervention approach taking a more active role. The goal for the different approaches is to, with the bottoms-up approach, allow entrepreneurs to allocate resources to the highest valued uses. The government top-down approach is more about correcting market failures and strategically directing the resources. There's some evidence that, the bottoms-up approach, I've been studying this now for 7 years, and the evidence overwhelmingly screams to me that it encourages more entrepreneurship, promotes innovation, but there's some potential underinvestment in early stage innovation, right? So there may be this issue. Whereas the top-down approach, we've seen that, it facilitates patenting, which is, potentially a good thing, plays a certification role in terms of firms that, getting the benefit of being able to get follow-on investment, but also some potential risk of it crowding out investment and potentially encouraging unproductive entrepreneurship and some resource misallocations, okay? So to wrap things up, see what you all think. Which approach is more effective in fostering entrepreneurship? So if you take a minute to answer that poll, and then we'll wrap things up. And all right, so I've got a sample size of 45 now. That's good enough for power for me. The majority of you think that the bottom-up laissez-faire approach is more effective. About a quarter of you said that a balanced approach is good. Okay, so let me tell you what I think. Policymakers are increasingly interested in fostering entrepreneurship around the world. There's considerable evidence that the bottoms-up approach is just generally effective in encouraging entrepreneurship. However, it appears to be falling out of fashion in favor of this more top-down approach. On my trip over yesterday, I was looking at the Wall Street Journal, and this is one of the headlines that presidential nominee Kamala Harris puts government intervention at the heart of our economic policy. I'm not just trying to pick on Democrats here. The Republicans are just as guilty of this as the Democrats in our country. So I'm an equal opportunity hater, right? I'm not trying to push any one particular political group. I just didn't find a headline with this sort of direct relevance for President Trump. But despite good intentions, government failures can encourage interventions that unintentionally undermine sort of productive entrepreneurship. They can crowd out private investment. They can encourage sort of crony capitalism. And policymakers need to carefully consider not only how to address market failures, but also how to minimize the risk of government failure. So with that said, we've got some time left over for questions, and I would encourage you, if you want to connect with me, to scan the QR code and add me on LinkedIn. So thank you. All right, so questions, and I should repeat the question for those on the online to hear. Yes, sir.
So this is not a fair question because you're not necessarily in this batch of people. So why do politicians and bureaucrats think that they're smarter than everybody else so that they can invest more wisely?
Let me give you my perspective. As you're right, I'm not one of those bureaucrats, and it's probably a good thing I'm not, because I wouldn't do a very good job of it, because I personally would, say, let's kill this fun and kill off this bureaucracy. I don't think it's that they think they're smarter, although there might be that. I think that there's incredible incentives to promote these sort of policies. If you're an elected politician, right, you're trying to get re-elected and stay in office. How do you, one way you can do that is to be a proponent and advocate of small business. You can channel resources to those who may be able to return political favors. So I think there's strong political incentives, although maybe policymakers think that they can hire a team of experts that know better than the market. There's potentially that hubris.
So their risk is actually minimal because they're spending other people's money to make investments.
Oh, absolutely. Milton Friedman famously said that nobody's so generous as somebody who's spending, somebody else's money, right? And so the repercussions are very minimal. We saw in this case with Solyndra, right? It was exposed, but what was the repercussion to the administration? Very little. They just shut up and let it go away, right? Try to sweep it under the carpet. There's very little accountability. And whereas if you're a private investor and your investment sinks, you're going to pay the consequences of losing your money. And if you're investing taxpayer money, you celebrate it with a ribbon cutting ceremony. You go to Solyndra's factory and talk about how great this is. But if it fails, it doesn't affect you personally. There's no skin in the game. I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. What else? Yeah.
Is your perception that the top-down approach does promote entrepreneurship, productive entrepreneurship, but less effectively than the bottom-up approach? Or is the top-down approach actually discouraging entrepreneurship? Is it that negative?
Yeah, so the question is, from my perception, does the top-down approach encourage productive entrepreneurship or potentially discourage it? Is that correct? Okay, so I think this is a question that I'm still open-minded about. I'm trying to look at the evidence. I'm trying to be a good academic and not sort of approach this from an ideological perspective. Although theory sort of informs this to some extent. But I do believe that we see some evidence that some policies could be designed effectively to sort of create these sort of financing bridges that may allow, early stage innovators to invest time in developing technologies that could potentially be commercialized. I'm not convinced that there's good evidence that that for the SBI program, for instance, that it's being successful in its key objective in facilitating commercialization. I haven't seen the studies to suggest that. What we do know is that these firms are more likely to get patents, and there's some evidence that they're getting some follow-on sort of capital. I'm waiting for the study to look at whether they're actually sort of commercializing this product. And I think it's a mixed bag of fruit, and then the argument is, well, if we're getting some wins and a lot of losses, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm undecided on it. It could potentially be, if it's designed in a way that potentially minimizes that unproductive entrepreneurship, it potentially could be valuable. But I'm open to further evidence on it. Yeah. Anything else? Ahmad.
So with the NSF, the National Science Foundation programs, would that be an example of top-down approach, a government's top-down approach to entrepreneurship?
Oh, absolutely, right? This is absolutely governments reallocating taxpayer monies to support, like the iHub, for instance, right? That's a very top-down approach, trying to channel taxpayer money into universities to try and facilitate sort of innovation and entrepreneurship. So I'm waiting on the research to start coming out on that to see what we find there, and I can update my my analysis. But we'll see how it goes. I don't have any evidence to sort of discuss, so I will remain ambivalent about it. All right, got time for a few more? Is everybody just so convinced, or are you just ready to get outside and enjoy the weather? The good news is the jackhammer stopped. That's because I did such a good job that I didn't have to have any more dramatic effects.
Well, I guess thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for the presentation.